You know them, you love them. It's butterflies and moths. Well, at least you've seen some, and maybe you love some of them? Hey everybody, it's Dan Hodges with you from the Johnny Appleseed Park District. We're doing virtual day camp again this week. It's all about bugs, but this time we're going to focus on butterflies and moths. What a cool group of animals. These guys belong to an order called Lepidoptera, and they're more similar than they are different. But I figured we'd talk just a little bit about Lepidopterans today, just kind of briefly touch on what I think makes these guys such an interesting group. Let's get started. So here's a couple examples of really typical butterfly and moth. And you can see the one on the left, we know this is a butterfly. Look how beautiful this is. And the one on the right, well, he's pretty drab and boring. Must be a moth, right? Well, Lepidoptera is actually a huge group of animals with 180,000 or more different types of butterflies or moths. They comprise probably 10% of all organisms that we know, second only to beetles. Butterflies and moths belonging to this group Lepidoptera have a couple defining characteristics. One of them is that they're scaly winged. Actually, that's what the word Lepidoptera means, scaly winged. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Another is their proboscis, their long sort of straw-like drinking mouth part. Some of them have very reduced proboscis. But another defining characteristic is they undergo complete metamorphosis. And we'll talk about that in a moment too. So they have scaly wings. Here's a beautiful Luna moth, by the way. If you haven't seen a Luna moth, you're definitely missing out. But you can see this beautiful animal, mostly green, but look at those beautiful eye spots. Aren't those interesting? Let's get a little bit closer. As we get closer to these little eye spots, you can see they're made up of all sort of these parts, almost like pixels, right? If you look from a distance. Let's get a little bit closer. Those are scales. Those are growing out of the wing of this moth, and this is what's typical of butterflies and moths in the order Lepidoptera. Let's get a little bit closer. This electron microscope, this isn't mine, but this I think is really interesting because those holes in there are usually about 400 to 800 nanometers wide, which is the width of a wavelength of light. So some moths and butterflies can have an iridescent quality because they're toying with how the light moves through these scales or is refracted off of them. A really, really interesting sidetrack there if you want to get interested in butterflies and moths. But their life cycle, this complete metamorphosis, this is something we've learned about in school a long time ago, right? The eggs hatch and the caterpillar, the larval stage of the butterfly, the caterpillar goes around and eats and eats and eats. Sometimes he's very, very hungry. So this hungry caterpillar eats everything he can find, or maybe just a few specific genera of plants. And then he'll go into this pupa stage, this pupal stage. And that can be a little bit different for moths and butterflies, but they both have this stage of their life. And while they're in this pupal stage, some parts of their body are growing and other parts are diminishing, and I would not necessarily rearranging, but definitely reconfiguring how they are. And then when they come out of that pupal stage, you find the beautiful adult. Really, the life cycle should look a little bit more like this, where the egg hatches and that caterpillar, that larva, goes through a series of growth stages. We call those instars, as the caterpillar sheds its skin to grow just a little bit bigger. And then it eats and eats and eats. It sheds its skin again to grow bigger yet again. And it does this several times before it enters that pupal stage and eventually emerges as an adult. So sometimes we find things that aren't quite our typical butterfly and moth. Sometimes we've got animals that look like a butterfly, but maybe it's a moth. Or maybe that's a moth, but it's probably a butterfly. Not really sure. Sometimes we find things in between, and it's really hard to tell the difference. So here's a few characteristics you can tell butterflies from moths. First of all, moths greatly outnumber the butterflies in terms of their species and their diversity. There's over 3,000 different types of moths right here in Ohio, while butterflies, there's only 137 different types of butterflies here in Ohio. Moths are generally nocturnal. Now, that doesn't mean all moths are. There's 3,000 different types of them, and a lot of them are active during the day. But most moths are active at night, whereas butterflies are all active during the day. They're diurnal. Another way you can tell moths from butterflies is by looking at their antenna. So butterfly antennae have kind of a club or a knob at the end of a long, slender antenna, whereas moths can have a lot of variability. A lot of times they're fern-like. Sometimes they're really slender and thread-like. You can have a lot of variability in the moth antenna. Moths generally will hold the wings either over their back at rest or sometimes out to the side, but usually pressed against whatever they're sitting on. And this, again, is a generalization. There's a lot of different moths. But butterflies will typically hold their wings straight up over their body while they're at rest. Moths typically have plump, hairy bodies, so they're usually a little bit fuzzier. Those scales growing all over the body, not just on the wings, but those scales kind of act as fur almost, as an insulation, because most moths, again, are active at night and it's a little bit cooler. Whereas butterflies usually have sort of a sleek, smooth body, and a lot of the time that's because they don't need insulation to keep them warm. The sun is usually on their side. I like to say that moths sort of wear whatever's comfortable, and butterflies are often dressed up. And this, again, is a real generalization, but most of our butterflies are very beautiful and very showy, and most of our moths are more drab or cryptic and not trying to be as flashy, although sometimes their more muted colors and patterns can be just as beautiful as some of those shiny, flashy colors of the butterfly. So we know that both moths and butterflies, after they've matured in their larval stage, the caterpillar's grown up, they're going to form a pupa. And for a moth, that pupa looks like this and is often enclosed in a cocoon. So the caterpillar, before it becomes a pupa, will spin a cocoon around itself. And then the organism on the inside of this little sleeping bag of silk will pupate inside of the cocoon. A butterfly doesn't do this. Instead, the caterpillar will shed its skin, and then that pupa kind of forms this chrysalis. So the skin, the outside of the body of the animal, begins to look pretty different. And sometimes it takes just a little bit of time for that shape to come out. But here's the pupa of a red spotted purple. They both form this pupal stage, and they both look like that pupa. One on the inside of a cocoon, moths for the most part, not all of them. And then for butterflies, that pupa changes shape a little bit and becomes what we call a chrysalis. My last on the list here is that butterflies are basically moths. And really, it's true. This Lepidoptera, there's so much diversity in the moths, and the butterflies are really just kind of a subset of a different type of moth, you could say. So there you go. That's butterflies versus moths. Which one is your favorite? Perhaps it's the butterflies because you've seen them more often because they're out during the day. But I challenge you to get out a little bit at night, or even during the day, and try to find some of these moths that fly during the day that will come to your porch light at night. There's some really, really interesting animals out there, butterflies and moths. So thanks for joining me, and don't forget, gotta get outside.